So I'm Scott Helm. I'm the director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. And when this idea started for this session, the kind of concept was, how do we talk about finance and diversity? And if you want something, if you want your own kind of modern day cone to like one hand clapping, contemplate that one for a while. Like, how do you have a discussion about finance and diversity? And what actually ended up happening is, through a series of searches, I found a blog post that I'll put in the chat at some point, that talked about how policies, like these hidden barriers of policies, right? And there was a book out years ago called The New Jim Crow, and that I really like, that I think is really good. And you can weigh in on however you want to, but what I thought it illustrated important concepts for us to think about, right? And what I found when I was reading this blog was that it kind of was of the same spirit. But the idea here is, like, we have policies that are in place, right, that actually further our lack of diversity. And that's kind of what this panel is going to talk about, and what I'll talk about. Now, I would like to point out one additional thing, is that the very first navigation series we had on this, and probably our last one, tends to focus on racial and ethnic diversity, which is critically important. We're going to broaden this one a little bit, right? So that we're also going to talk about gender diversity, LGBTQ, definitely still racial and ethnic diversity. But I think we're looking at diversity in a broader bucket, right? And when we talk about diversity, the value of different perspectives and why that's so important. But as we think about financial policies and some of the topics we're going to hit upon, there's no doubt that, the research shows, and I don't want to really get into a huge discussion about this, but I will give a caveat that I'm an economist and I know the research, that women make less than men, that women of color make even less than white women, and that people of color make less than their majority counterparts. And so we know these things exist. And as we get into this kind of policy discussion, I think it's important that we kind of have that and be a little broader in our diversity discussion, so that we're including all the groups that are underrepresented. So joining me this morning, my favorite panelist, my favorite human, Jillian Helm, who some of you know is my wife and is also the executive director of Literacy Kansas City, and helped me kind of put this panel together. So I'm indebted to her on that. Justin Gust, who is from El Centro. He's the director of health policy. So very, very grateful for him to join us. And Yolanda Walden, who is with Skill KC, and also super grateful for you joining us also, Yolanda. So I think we have a really great group of people that have seen the blog that I was referencing. And I think we're just gonna go off and start with a conversation. We'll probably have a conversation for about a half hour, and then allow the group to kind of weigh in on questions. The last thing I'll say is, people say a good discussion, but enough about the discussions. What can we do to help fix this? This is that discussion of what you can do. We're going to talk about how you can change policy in your organization and in the community in such a way that it helps enable a culture for more inclusion and diversity. And so, Jill, I'm going to kick off with you, if it's okay. And when you took over Literacy Kansas City, it was pretty white. There wasn't a lot of representation in leadership, and you've kind of had a process to try and to develop a culture that's more inclusive. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Again, my name is Jillian Helm. I'm the CEO of Literacy KC. For those of you who do not know, we are an adult basic education organization offering everything from basic reading, writing to high school equivalency, workforce development, and English as a second language. And so when it comes to, being very, very aware day in and day out of leading an organization as someone who looks like me, serving a population, 90% of which does not look anything like me, And over half of those are representative of 57 different countries around the world. It becomes very, very important that DEI, and take it one step further, belonging, and one step further even, and talk about anti-racism, is, you know, central to what we do as an organization, and it needs to be woven into the thread and the fiber of the very organization and how we operate. So, you know, Scott mentioned that when I took over a number of years ago, we were fairly heavily white, Caucasian. And over the years, you know, it hasn't been so much a policy change necessarily, but a cultural shift toward making sure that our hiring policies are representative of or really centered toward increasing the diversity on our staff and on our board. You know, we still have a long way to go. Our leadership team could stand to be more diverse, and I will say that up front. But I am really, really proud of the level at which our board has been diversified, our staff has been diversified, and if you look at our instructors specifically, you know, many of them look like and are representative of the cultures from which our students come. And that's something that's, you know, critically important to, especially, can you imagine, you know, being an immigrant refugee person coming to this country, you have 90 days with a resettlement agency, and then you have to go to English class. And, you know, how great is it that your instructor is someone who you can connect with? So that's the kind of thing that we keep central to, you know, our hiring policies, our staffing policies, and building a culture of belonging for not only our staff, but specifically to our students.
So Yolanda, I shared with all of you that little blog post, and there were 4 kind of areas in that blog that talked about that are barriers to a really inclusive organization, that we have policies that are kind of inhibiting it. One is pay transparency and equity. Another is paycheck frequency. A third is expense reimbursement policies. And a fourth is financial transparency and inclusivity. Did any of those hit home with you from your perspective of barriers that you've seen, or are there other kind of policy barriers that you see that really are inhibitive to inclusion?
Actually, some of these actually hit home personally, like that I actually was in that work environment and experienced, like the paycheck frequency. Being in education, I was only getting paid once a month and not paid a lot as well. You kind of hit 2 things when you talked about earlier. It's obvious I'm a Black woman, so I'm also at the bottom of typically the bottom of the pay scale. And so just even walking through those experiences, it's challenging, trying to sustain a livable, you know, household, taking care of my family, and like trying to balance for a whole month. Because yes, I was living paycheck to paycheck, but imagine, you know, people who get paid every 2 weeks living paycheck to paycheck, but getting paid once a month living paycheck to paycheck takes a special type of skill sets to do. And so that is definitely something that hinders a lot of people to be able to live besides means or survival. And so that is something we definitely need to like address and talk about. Also, on top of that, I was part of the group that had to pay out of pocket reimbursements and have to wait for those to be reallocated back to me. So if you're already on a month-to-month pay scale and then happen to wait to be reimbursed for expenses, that means you're taking resources from your home to wait until you can get that money back. And so really that is something that organizations, especially non-for-profits, have to really look at and adjust in their practice and policy of frequency of those, the payroll and reimbursements. So yes, definitely agree with those too.
Thank you, Yolanda. Justin, I guess I'd pose the same question to you, and you can also take this into the broader health policy space in the community of barriers you see from that perspective.
Yeah, well, I would say from kind of my standpoint at El Centro, I recently had some turnover this past year. And part of that, I think, was definitely due to the pay. We have a lot of kind of younger staff who are looking for jobs that pay more. And it's really hard to compete when we have some positions that are paying under $15 an hour here. People don't necessarily, it's not that they don't want to do the job, but if they can go down the street and get paid $6 to $7 more for doing a different type of job, they're probably going to go with the job that pays more. So that's kind of causing some kind of recruitment issues, if you will, I would say. Another thing that kind of stuck out to me, and it wasn't mentioned in the blog necessarily, but is the transparency around grant funded programs. My first job was not with El Centro, but somewhere else out of college. And I wasn't exactly explained the whole process of what it means to be grant funded. I just was there, I was happy to do the job. And then I was told, a few months after my job had actually ended, that there was no more funding for my position. And I either had to transfer into a different position or, kind of look for a new job. So that's something that now as a director, I'm definitely doing with my staff, is having those conversations up front or even during the interview process with them to let them know, this is a grant funded position. It's not a guarantee that the funding will always be here for that, but that's my job to worry about and to try to bring in that funding. But this way they know, this may be a permanent position, this might not be a permanent position. I think that's a very important conversation to have with people, especially with younger workers who might be new to the nonprofit world, because I myself had no idea. And it's not that it was necessarily a bad thing, but I think more transparency around all of that and kind of the processes of the nonprofit world are something we definitely need to work on teaching, especially younger workers who might not have as much exposure to the nonprofit world.
Thanks. Yeah, I was struck by what was eye-opening to me was how in the nonprofit sector, we like to think of ourselves as the do-gooders or this virtue group, which I think we are generally. But we've also adopted some real arcane policies from our sibling sectors that are more about protecting the corporation versus advocating on behalf of our employees. And that pay transparency one blew me away when you think about it. Now, in all fairness, I've worked my entire professional career where you can look up my salary. So pay transparency for me has always seemed like, I've never understood why people weren't open about it in some ways, but I also just kind of took it for granted. And, Jill, you run an organization. Jillian, you're the CEO of a nonprofit. When you read about pay transparency, where are you guys with that kind of policy position? And did it hit home with you? I mean, even as a female ascending to an executive director position, it affects that also.
Yeah, it does. So I really love this conversation because, for Literacy KC, for instance, we are in the middle of actually a diversity, equity, inclusion audit. So we have hired a consultant. They've come in, worked with our DEI committee, and we're in the process. One of the exercises that the consultants did with us was what they call the stop, start, continue, and consider exercise. And you go, you open it up to your entire staff and you ask them for feedback about things the organization should stop doing, start doing, consider doing, or continue doing. And I was reviewing that document as I was preparing for today, and not one thing that somebody said was around finance policy, not one thing. So it's not even something that people think front of mind has to do with diversity and equity and things like that. So, and it really sort of brought that into focus for me, because we do have a policy that we don't pay anyone under $15 an hour, but that's not published anywhere. Nobody knows that, and so in preparing for today, that's something that we should be proud of and people should know. And then, as far as transparency is concerned, I sort of, was on the same page as you, Scott, which was, people can look up my salary, nonprofits are transparent in that way. But, I have never gone to the extent of, publishing the the budget as I prepare for it, or talking to different levels of the organization about salary levels and things like that. So that's definitely something to consider. And I think we have so much hesitancy around that kind of thing. And you talk about our sort of the nonprofit ways of paying and setting salary and things like that. And one of the things that is really important to me as a CEO of an organization is to pay people fairly for what they're worth and not take advantage of their passion for what they do, which I think is another thing that we do in the nonprofit sector a lot. And it's like, just because you are passionate about the cause does not, I mean, if anything, that should mean you should get paid more, than a counterpart.
This is for my mother-in-law.
And so, yeah, those are the things that I keep front of mind, and that this conversation have really brought into focus for me.
Great, thank you. Yolanda, I wanted to kind of hit on, I know that part of what you do, right? I mean, you've been in education a long time, you're skilling people up, right, for careers. So I would say either from an organization perspective or just what you see out there in the marketplace of what barriers do the people you work with report back to you that say, they're either not even how we write a job description, right? So things along those lines, which can become an invisible barrier to people with diversity, from a diversity and inclusion perspective. Anything in sky's the limit, anything from your perspective that you also see as barriers that exist out there?
I would say diversity in education credentials. So for example, working a lot, talking with people in IT verticals or industry, there are some jobs in that area that does not necessarily require a 2 or 4 year degree or diploma, but yet HR practices listed in their job description and don't even leave room for maybe experience or years of experience prior to. And that is what I'm really seeing as a huge barrier for individuals who may fall in that bucket or category, because we have always pushed the traditional go to college, which may not necessarily be for everyone, and everyone have different skill sets and values. So that is a major one that I feel like we lack inclusion on, and diversity in thinking and thought process.
So I will tell you that one of the things I'm most proud of that I helped do at the Block School is one of my roles has been the director of the executive MBA. You need an undergraduate degree traditionally to get an MBA degree. We actually got rid of that requirement for people who had to go into the workforce, who went straight into the workforce out of undergrad and have achieved at a high level in their career. So they're at director, senior director type levels. We piloted that program 3 years ago, and we've now had 2 people graduate from our executive MBA who actually didn't have undergraduate degrees. It probably won't surprise you that the majority of that pool are either women or racial and ethnic minority populations who had to go to work sooner without the advantage of getting to take the 4-year vacation that I got to take in college, because they needed to earn money to support themselves or their family and things along those lines. And I think that's another one of those barriers that we had that just didn't make sense. There's no relationship between an MBA and an undergraduate business degree. Sorry to blow anybody's mind on that, but we have people from art school in our MBA programs who've never taken a business class. It made no sense. So I think that's a really good example, Yolanda, of some of those barriers. Justin, what about you? Other kind of community, any other barriers you see out there that we should be talking about?
For our clients and just the Latino community at large, a couple things come to mind. One is still language access. Kansas City is still growing. We're not like California or Texas where you go and everything is in English and Spanish. You might find Spanish in some places, but the majority of services are still advertised in English. It's definitely hard because we get that conversation a lot, or that question a lot is, we've been trying to reach out to the Latino community, but no one's answering the call, what's going on? Well, one, if it's not in Spanish, that's kind of where it falls short, And there's a lot of other health programs out there too that I've seen advertised, and I'm like, wow, this would be great, but no one's going to find out about this because it's not in their language. So whether it's Spanish or any other kind of language, considering, you know, that skill that those workers are bringing for being bilingual is also another area that I see a lot of need in, and have had a lot of conversations with people who are bilingual, who are able to do medical interpreting, but oftentimes they're underpaid, or they get put into a position where they're wearing now two hats and doing two different jobs. Not only am I a clinical care coordinator or a community health worker, but now I'm also in charge of translating all of the materials into Spanish, or I'm now the sole person who reaches out to people who are Spanish speaking. And they're oftentimes put in kind of that dual job, but they're not compensated for it. So there's a lot of conversation that still needs to be had around, you know, people who are bringing those extra skills in, but also in the recruiting efforts, and also just the ability to work with people in their language as well. I think those are definitely two of the barriers that we see a lot, because I do come across people who are very talented, young, talented people, but unfortunately they're either not really offered a job that's compensating them for the work they're actually doing, or their primary language of Spanish tends to get in the way of, well, not gets in the way, it's kind of the opposite. We don't allow space or allow an opportunity for those whose other language is not English, a space at the table or to try to get the job. Those are the two things that stick out to me.
That's great. Jillian, I know, just because we know each other,
Sort of.
kind of, I know that because of your state grant, you've had some issues with some policies that don't fully make sense around education, right? Like where people can't actually be educators who would be great educators. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then I want to go into, to wrap up this half hour, not the whole session, what can we do to get active to change some of this stuff?
Yeah, so the way that Literacy KC is funded, about 2/3 of our funding comes directly from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Along with that comes a lot of compliance and regulations and things like that. Yolanda knows this language really well too. But one of those regulations is that anyone who does anything like interpreting test scores for students or teaching a class has to have a 4-year degree. So for instance, I have somebody on staff who's been working directly with our students for years. She's fantastic. She has, you know, all of the trust built up with these students, all of the rapport, you know, they adore her, but because she does not have a 4-year degree, someone they trust cannot help them interpret their test scores. And she's not allowed to sub in for a class or something like that, even though she has all of the qualifications, as far as I'm concerned, to do that. But we would not be in compliance if we allowed that to happen. However, if, you know, someone with an economics degree or a finance degree or Scott could come in and do any of those things just because he has that 4-year degree. So it doesn't matter necessarily. I mean, it's sort of what he's been talking about with the requirements for being eligible for a master's program. You know, in some ways, like it's just so antiquated, and it doesn't make any sense that someone who is not necessarily historically, you know, qualified to teach basic literacy or something like that, can come in and do that as far as DESE's concerned, but you know, someone who's been actually doing the work for years and years cannot. And so that's one of the things that we struggle with. As far as what we can do about it, you know, that's just something that we need to continue, you know, in our mission statement. Advocacy is central to what we do for our students. And so, you know, how we can continue to advocate for our staff and for our students is something that we work on every day too. And so trying to find ways around how we can have positions that are based on experience and based on talent and skill and agilities and things like that, rather than those hard requirements that are education focused, is something that we try and do based on our flexibility of our privately funded portion of our budget. So that 1/3 remaining, we have to raise year over year, but that's where the flexibility comes in to support positions that we can list, you know, as far as when we're advertising to fill a position, we can say 2 or 4 year degree in a relevant field or the equivalent experience. And that's something that we try and do as much as possible and lead by example, at least on that 1/3 of our business.
Yolanda, I know we're going to lose you here in a couple minutes. What actions can we take how can we get into action from your perspective?
I want to kind of address, I think it's Kat's question in the comments. So one thing that we have done as Skill KC is looking at our policy. We try to put some things in place of where we have to recruit or advertise and market in certain sectors in industry, like do direct targeting marketing for hiring practices or postings. Also, we have to have so many candidates that are qualified if we know of their background, that they fall either in a gendered bucket or racial bucket, to make sure that the pool that even comes to the hiring level is diverse. So those are some things, practices that we have put in place to try to make sure that we are inclusive in our hiring practices. And so I think that would be something that could be beneficial to make movement in this space. Other things we have done is also try to be transparent with our budget internally as well. Even though we're a grantee, we still try to make sure that we share that information so that way it's transparent. I mean, that's one of the things that kind of makes this work flow better. Is the more transparent you are, the better outcomes you can have as far as making sure everybody's inclusive. And that way questions can arise, like, why is so-and-so being paid more? What is the value? And then we also did things with our education piece with years of experience. Like, it's not just you have to have a bachelor's degree, but it could be the years of experience, and it's not and, it's a or.
So huge applause for you for certifying a pool. You know, it at the very least creates the opportunity for interview opportunities for people who've traditionally been left out. So huge kudos for what you guys are doing there. Justin, what kind of action can we get into?
I think, especially if you're looking at bilingual candidates, taking into consideration their skills, their experience that they have, and trying to be able to compensate that a little bit. It is pretty hard to be like a nationally certified interpreter. There's 2 different accrediting bodies right now, and so there's a little confusion around that. There's a confusion in that part of the workforce that they're trying to see which of these accreditations is going to last longer, or which hospitals, like one hospital might take one but not the other. But really looking at any of that experience that the candidate brings to the job or to the position. Someone asked in the questions, you know, how can you support your bilingual staff, especially if it's just one person. I think being able to provide them extra training, extra resources, and really looking at their workflow. You know, they might be seeing 10 clients or 10 patients versus someone else who's seeing the same amount, but knowing that it's taking even longer to break down those language barriers with those clients and patients, and kind of recognizing the work balance between all of the staff. Oftentimes where I think people and my colleagues I've heard from become frustrated in those positions is when they start to feel alone and they start to feel isolated. And when they talk to their manager or when they talk to Administration, they just hear crickets, or they hear like, oh yeah, we know it's an issue, but it's not that high priority of an issue, so we're going to table the conversation. And that's where they start to feel burned out and leave. So I think trying to support them in any way possible, but really taking a look at kind of the balance of work among staff, and also to just continue hiring bilingual workers, and really trying to build up that part of your workforce, especially if your organization is going into servicing a new population or a new community. It's not a shift that happens overnight. And oftentimes we see like an organization start one program and they have one bilingual worker, but they want them to start reaching out to the whole community and population and do all of this work. And that's impossible. You really need to start building up internally, and also asking yourself internally, do we have the things in place to start to become a more inclusive organization for Spanish speakers? Our forms in Spanish are, visually appealing when people come in? Are things in Spanish or not? Oftentimes people want to jump the gun and they just want to start providing services or classes, but they're not internally prepared to handle everything that comes with that.
Yeah, so fantastic. There are two communities we haven't talked as much about, but I guess I think it can be part of this conversation. LGBTQ, right, is Q plus is one that I feel very, I think is critically important into the, are we creating workplaces that are hospitable, belonging? Are we creating an environment that's welcoming and belonging? The other one, and Rebecca, thanks for bringing it up. Neurodiversity is something I'm extremely passionate about, probably because I would benefit from a little more of it in the workplace. And I'm curious, Jillian, Justin, and others can weigh in. Those two populations, have you given thought to neurodiversity, LGBTQ, including how bathrooms are structured at your places, things along those lines? Jillian, you want to weigh in first?
Yeah, one of the things that we try and be really intentional about when writing job descriptions, a lot of times you'll say, a position will say something like, you have to have your own car, you have to be able to lift so many pounds, you have to be able to navigate a space or whatever it is. And you can phrase those things in such a way that's like, you don't necessarily have to have your own car, but you have to be able to get yourself from point A to point B. So whatever your physical limitations might be, if you can do that, then we can figure it out, So those are the types of things I think when we just write a generic job description that we need to be cognizant of. And somebody said, you have to be able to do 70% or 30% or whatever it is of the requirements listed. I think having a caveat in that position description that's like, we're always willing to have a conversation with someone who's qualified for the position to figure out how we can accommodate whatever it is that your physical or mental needs may be. And then having also for neurodiverse people, we try and have quiet spaces where people can go just to, if they need to be able to just recharge or something, whatever it is, if they just need to step away and recharge. And then as far as LGBTQIA plus and things like that, that's also part of our DEI audit. So how can we be better about building inclusive spaces for people? And it all sort of goes together in that, when you walk into a space physically, what does it look like? What are the colors you choose? Like all of it goes into building an aesthetic that is inclusive and where people can walk in and automatically feel comfortable no matter what, where they come from or what their background may be. And one of the, and I think somebody said something about transparency equals trust. And I think trust is sort of the critical component of this conversation that we're sort of dancing around here. And one of the conversations that I like to use as an example, especially around LGBT, inclusion is we talked about, people are like, what can we do? What can we do? And one of the things that people sort of want to do and think is a great idea is to have everybody put their pronouns after their names. Hey, when you work here, add your pronouns. But we had a conversation in an open, in a high trust environment that we were able to cultivate with our staff. And one person said, if I had to do that, I would feel very, very uncomfortable because I am not comfortable yet with my own gender identity. And if I had to do that, then it would be really scary for me to have to identify as a specific gender at this time in my process. What we can do is say, you can do that if you want to. Add your pronouns, great, because that signifies to people who are struggling like that you're an ally, that you get it, that you can be an ally, that you can be a trustworthy person to come to. But let's not force people to do that because you never quite know, what they're going through either.
It's a great point. Justin, any thoughts?
I think Jill hit it on the head, especially having kind of that aesthetic appeal when you walk into a place. You kind of know right away what the vibe is. Is this a welcoming place? Is this more like a corporate? Am I dressed appropriately to be here? All those things kind of go through your mind when you go into a space. That is one thing I'm happy here at El Centro that we've incorporated is the gender neutral bathrooms. So here at our Olathe office, we just kind of renovated and we have 3 bathrooms that are just bathrooms. There's it's a female bathroom, there's a male bathroom. They're just bathrooms. So I think that it definitely makes the more inclusive. It is definitely about having those conversations, even though they might feel tense or might feel something bad is going to happen or someone's going to say something at this meeting and it's going to end horribly. But I think if you don't have those or you don't allow the space to have those conversations, you're never going to progress. And that's something I've heard, especially from some of the younger staff that we've had leave recently, is that they definitely wanted to see more space for having training, for having conversations, even if they're unofficial conversations, but having more type of staff development in that type of setting to be able to talk about all of these issues as a whole, rather than, just an administrator making a decision and it going down the line. They wanted to see, we have quite a few LGBTQ people who work here. And some of them had talked about, what would it look like if we had a group that met for lunch, once a month to talk about issues here in the workplace, and rather some employers might kind of feel challenged in a way, thinking, they're going to plot something against us or, they're forming this club because they want to break off or whatever. But honestly, allowing them the space to do that, I think you're going to get much more rich feedback, especially from your own employees about things that they see and that they experience in the workplace that you might not hear from them otherwise by doing a survey or other type of kind of qualitative review.
Bunch of good comments coming in, kind of fast and furious on different areas that I think we haven't hit on, which I think are worth elevating. My old friend Susan Lewis, Mental Health America, talked about, diversity with people with mental illness. There you are, Susan. Good to see you. I'll let you chime in here in a second. And I think not the same thing, but I think related, trauma-informed offices, right? I will tell you, secondary trauma is a big deal. Principal trauma is also a big deal, but so many of us who work in the spaces, I'm not going to include myself in it because I don't work with traumatized populations, but many of you have employees who do. Are we creating an environment that's welcoming and hospitable? And do we have policies in place for the people who are constantly working with people who are traumatized and the secondary trauma that comes from that? Do we have policies that inhibit that kind of work? But I would also argue, do we have policies that are welcoming to people who have are survivors of trauma experiences and are still processing through that. Susan, do you real quick, do you want to kind of give a little plug in about the value of diversity for people with mental health?
Sure. We've got 17 employees, and there are 2 of us who I do not know for 100% sure have lived experience with a major mental illness, and those 2 both have first order family members with lived experience of mental illness. For some of our folks, it's a bona fide occupational qualification. For the rest of us, we just kind of gravitate and end up here. And what we've found for the last 25 years or so that I've been in this seat is that it involves establishing a culture that I've not had a reasonable, I've had one reasonable accommodation. It was for someone who had stair climbing. But we do things like having policies on the timing of your workday that may accommodate anything from biorhythms to putting kids on a school bus to my medications make me sleepy in the morning. Within reason, pick your start time. If you're going to work 8 hours in a day, if you're not worth it till 9, don't come in at 8. Work till 6. We also have a very liberal sick leave time, which allows people to take those for any kind of medical illness, any kind of appointment in themselves or their family members. And we define family pretty broadly there. The other piece of that is we do have a no fault attendance policy, which does allow us to track individuals who are actual attendance problems from an HR standpoint, but a supervisor is allowed to waive a deduction from that point bank if they know that this is because of a pre-existing condition that employee doesn't have to tell me, wow, my bipolar's kicking up or my asthma is kicking up, just this is an ongoing thing. And then they don't lose points in their attendance bank. If you get the flu, yes, but if you have a cold, yes. But if it's an ongoing medical above or below the neck issue that you deal with or someone in your family deals with, it doesn't count against you, from a performance standpoint or an evaluation standpoint for attendance. Those are just a couple of the things we do. There are literally probably hundreds more. But we've found that we actually manage a retention rate for our peer support workers, many of whom have never worked outside of anything because of their mental illness, that is about 20 percentage points higher than for first year out social workers going into case management.
So I think Susan's organization is important for a couple of reasons. So I did work with Susan, a decade ago on some strategy stuff.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah.
I had hair at that point. It was a good time in my life.
Mine was dark.
Yeah, Susan's was darker and I had it. But this is the reason I bring that up is we were looking at strategies and at the time, I think 85% of your workforce were people with diagnosed mental health challenges. And I, as a strategy person, I was like, Susan, it might be, we might be able to get a little further if we push that down to, let's say 50% or something along those lines. She wouldn't let me do it. And she was like, no way. No way. I think why and it was a policy there, right? So it was a policy. And so people are always saying enough conversation. What do you do? There's a great example of what you can do, right? It was a commitment to who they were, to their values, and to what it meant to be that organization in their DNA. And they thrived because of it, right? So I'm wrong. I was wrong. She was right. But the point is, it's really, really important to know who you are and to have fidelity to those value statements and to codify that so that you are the type of organization. So when somebody like me comes from the outside and says, no, do it this way because that's what the books will tell you to do, you can tell them they're wrong. And so I just think that's such a good example to bring up. Jillian, I want to throw it back to you for, we have so many groups, but one of them, I really want to talk a little bit about opportunities for women in the workplace and your maternity paternity policies, and when did they even start?
Well, they started when I got pregnant with our first baby, because prior to that, we did not have one. And so at the time, I went to my executive director, my predecessor at the time, and the board, and said, you know, what kind of policy can we create around maternity leave? And it was, you know, one of the very reaffirming things that have happened over the course of my career with Literacy KC is that they created one specifically for me. And then that way we had one on the books, we established a maternity policy, and now as CEO, I'm able to extend that also to paternity leave. And so we've just, and we do that very flexibly. You know, it's not that someone has to take the time immediately. Right now we have someone who had a baby a few months ago, and his wife is now going back to work, and he's going to start his paternity leave now that the baby's a few months old. And that's great. You know, however we can allow for flexibility around taking care of your family is something that we keep central to what we do. And it was really great to hear Susan talk about that kind of thing. You know, we've had staff suffer traumatic brain injuries. We've had staff go through all sorts of different things as far as medical things are concerned that cause pretty extensive and long-term challenges for those folks. And because flexibility is really important to how we operate, you know, we've been able to accommodate those folks. Right now, you know, we have that person who's struggling with a traumatic brain injury, and she's able to go home in the middle of the day and take a break because that's what she needs in order to be successful. But if we're not allowing that, you know, then what Susan's talking about is you won't have the retention rates. You won't have that culture built up to where people want to stay. And then what Justin was talking about earlier, you do actually, you know, the stuff that might seem scary at first, allowing leadership positions to be vulnerable sometimes, to feedback, to, you know, transparency and things like that actually benefits you in the long run. It might feel a little uncomfortable at first, but you turn around and on the other end, you come out stronger.
You know, Justin, the trauma piece, and I'm sorry, I'm so ignorant to this when it initially came up, but if you're comfortable weighing in on it, the community you serve, and because of that, your employees dealt with some pretty horrific circumstances about 8 years ago. There was a bunch of stuff in the newspapers around raiding churches and INS immigration raids and things in some of our communities. And I know from relationships, personal relationships I had, people stopped going to church. People almost became prisoners in their own homes. Can you talk about it? Not the politics of this, that's not the point, but can you talk about how, as an organization, you guys, if you were there, I don't know if you were there at the time, but just in general, that stuff still exists, I'm sure. How you deal with that type of trauma for your employees as well as others in your community?
Yes, it definitely did we've seen shifts in the immigration policies. But at that time that you're talking about, yeah, it was very scary for a lot of our clients. Even some of our employees, you know, we have employees that are DACA employees. We also have employees who are not citizens, but permanent residents, which their experience that they bring to the job is incredible, especially in being able to relate to other clients that are going through their own immigration process or reaching out for help on that. It's invaluable to have them here. But at the same time, it was a very scary type of experience to go through. One of the first things I would say that we put into practice is definitely not asking about immigration status to our clients. You know, it's on our intake form, but we don't officially ask them, you know, are you a citizen? What's your social security number? because we don't want to put them in that awkward position of having to either tell us or possibly lie to us or feel, like we're not welcoming. So that's definitely the first thing that we've done. We do have to ask that question when it comes to enrolling into certain programs. Don't get me wrong, but the way you have that conversation with your client also makes a difference. I don't ask, so you want to apply for Medicaid? I need to know, are you a citizen or permanent resident? I usually tell them, these are the guidelines, to qualify for Medicaid, you have to be a citizen or permanent resident. Do you think you qualify? And that gives them the space to then say yes or no, or answer how they want to. But the whole focus isn't just on their immigration status. That's definitely important to be welcoming to them. Another thing that we try to do, we have a lot of resources available for clients, but at the same time, we're not lawyers. We're not able to take on kind of those emergency cases that come up. So having a lot of conversations with my staff around boundaries. There are some things we want to dive all in and help people out as much as we can. But at the same time, there are services that if we start to provide them, we know we're not the ones who can actually provide that service at the end of the day. So having boundaries and being able to put boundaries into place really does help our staff to not get themselves in situations where they're feeling overwhelmed by trying to do something they're not qualified to do. When it comes to the secondhand trauma, that's something definitely real. We have a trauma-informed care training coming up in November as an organization. And I think for staff, it's again kind of allowing them the space to debrief and to talk about some of those difficult traumatic experiences or stories that they hear from their clients. Because if they don't and they just keep it bottled in, it's not going to help their productivity throughout the day. It's also going to start causing them to feel kind of negative. And if they're never able to talk about it, or to take a few minutes of my time during the day to come and say, hey, I have a really hefty case, can I talk about it with you? They're likely not going to want to stay. So I think it's definitely making the space, trying to be welcoming and not asking for so much information of your clients or your staff if it's not really needed. And then just being mindful that everyone that comes through your doors in a different position too. We have oftentimes assumed, people coming in are just seeking help for themselves, but that's not necessarily true. They might be asking for family, for friends. They might not even be coming in for help. They might just be coming in to learn how they can support your organization. So I think definitely not having assumptions, but being open to finding out more is very important.
Jillian, we're about wrap time. Did you have any kind of concluding comments about this space in this conversation?
I don't know if I have anything, if any final wise words or anything, but what Justin's talking about is so important, and allowing your staff. So Literacy KC, we don't necessarily deal directly with trauma, but because our student populations come from heavily traumatized backgrounds, and because we build so much trust with our students, we become sort of a secondary location, or when our students are experiencing trauma, they will come to us, and so our teachers who aren't necessarily trained in this type of thing become confidants for these students and trusted people to come to when something's going on. And so it's just so critically important. We just had a trauma-informed teaching professional development for our teachers, because so often, our locations become havens for our students who are experiencing trauma, and thereby our instructors, need to be able to delicately approach that, to deal with it, to be able to be empathetic to whatever it is the student is bringing them, and respond appropriately. But like Justin's saying, with a boundary set wherein they're not, navigating things that are beyond their expertise on behalf of a student. And so that's something I think that's really important. And, Justin, you were talking a while ago about your bilingual staff and how they get so much extra work put on them. One of the resources, if anybody's in this type of space, one of the resources that we've invested in is called Propio Language Services. And that way you have, you know, you can make a phone call and have a translator there on the phone. It's an extra cost to the organization, but that way you're not putting extra work on the people who are, who just happen to be bilingual or whatever it may be. So, you know, I just really appreciate the conversation. I know based on this conversation and the blog post, what I can do, what I will do as far as changing our policy and making those policy changes known to my staff, and what I can do better. And I think it's just, you know, it's a continued work in progress. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Jillian. Thanks, Justin, and Yolanda, who's no longer here in this session, but she was great also. You know, a couple things I heard, right? You can do some simple things like set up conversation groups immediately. It all starts with empathy from my perspective, this whole space does, and seeking opportunities to learn. I'm also grateful for all of you who signed on because, you know, what it started out, what I said was broad was actually pretty narrow. And then others talked about mental health diversity, neurodiversity, physical limitation diversity. Look, I think we can all do better. You know, from my perspective, why wouldn't I want to create the best environment for the most talent to be successful? And that's what diversity, to me, this is the least controversial topic ever. I want the most successful organization. And the best way to do that is to create an opportunity for everyone to thrive. And that's what to me is at the core of this. And I'll be a better person, better leader, better deliverer of services if I'm more understanding of the people that I'm working with. Somebody asked about the blog post. I will have Mark send it out to everybody who was on this call, so it'll come out in an email to everyone. As always, we're always grateful. These sessions don't happen without the nonprofit leaders like yourself signing on and being a part of the conversation. So Jillian, Justin, Yolanda, you're awesome. Everybody else who was on here, thank you so much. Great conversation. Have a great Tuesday.